I'd like to welcome everyone to the June meeting of the HB 737 Commission to study PFAS environmental health impacts. My name is Rosemary Rung. I'm representative for now Hillsborough District 12 in Merrimack. First thing on our agenda is approval of the May minutes. I know those came in last night. I want to get a feeling from the commission. Would anyone like to delay this to our July meeting, or do you feel like you've reviewed them enough to vote? If show of hands, if those would like to vote on the minutes today, raise your hand. Okay, we will defer them to the, oh, Lorraine, okay, I think you're the only one. So we will defer them to the July meeting. All right. And I want to welcome Mr. Don Provencher. He's chairman of the Board of Commissioners of the Merrimack Village District. I asked him to join us today to give an update on the status of the PFAS filtration systems that have been installed in the Merrimack Village District public wells. So Don, if you don't mind, I'd like to hand the meeting over to you.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, and good morning, everyone. Glad to see everybody here. We are further along in our treatment plant activation, which is good news. As you all know, wells 4 and 5 came online in October of 20, and so that's going to be 2 years this October. So we're about a year and a half in service on wells 4 and 5. The PFAS plant for wells 7 and 8 that's located over in Hollis is online as of March. And that had a little bit of a delay because a couple of things happened. One of the vessels hit a bridge in delivery, and that had to be reassessed and make sure it was in enough shape that it was still usable, which it was. And then when we installed the carbon media at the beginning of the year, the carbon had some iron material that was present in it, and it was actually dispensing iron into the drinking water. So never got into the drinking water, but in the flushing process, we were detecting high levels of iron. That has flushed its way out, so everything was online in March. And we are also pretty far along in the construction in our wells, the treatment plant for well 2 and 3. Actually, well 3 is being replaced by a new well 9. I don't know if you guys are aware of that, but because well 3 was going to require iron and manganese treatment, we decided to look at a new well, and we installed a new well a little bit closer to well 2, and that new well 9 hit a very excellent yield and has good water quality. It still needs PFAS treatment as expected, but the iron and manganese are quite a bit lower. So we have an application into the DES for review of that well 9, which is essentially going to replace well 3. So the treatment plant that's being constructed at well 2 is going to be capable of handling flows from well 2 and well 9. And that's targeted to come online just before the end of the year, sometime late fall, before the end of the year. So at that point, all of Merrimack's source water, MVD source water, will be treated. And that's kind of where we stand now. We're still purchasing water from Pennachuck water system through our interconnect down at Pennachuck Square and Route 101A. And we're doing that so that we can minimize the use of our untreated well water at well 2. So the only wells that are left that are untreated now is essentially well 2 and well 3. So we're using well 3 is offline. Well 2 is offline and only brought on as needed basis. But our primary demand is coming from Pennachuck, because that's compliant water, whereas well 2 is actually technically in most cases not compliant, but it's funny because we haven't been pumping that well too since October, but we still pump it on a monthly basis just to collect water samples. And there's a stark comparison when you don't pump well 2 and you only take a little bit of water for the sample you need for the PFAS. We're still doing monthly PFAS sampling. The last few samples have come back in the low single digits of PFOA. But we know in the past when we've pumped that well, the numbers go up over, 20. So I don't know what's causing that to happen, but there's definitely a relationship between the more you pump the well, the PFAS seems to go higher. So it's kind of a strange phenomenon that I don't think anybody really understands why it's going on, but that's what's happening. So technically well 2 is compliant right now based on those monthly samples. The last one was I think it was like around 4 parts per trillion. So that's kind of an anomaly. We don't know why that's happening, but we're sure once we start pumping it permanently, those numbers are going to creep right back up, probably get well over the 12 MCL as it has been in the past. So that's kind of where we are. I don't know if you have any other questions about more specific information.
Are there any questions from commission members for Don? I have oh yes, Ms. Mesmer.
Sorry. So that's interesting about that well, out of use and in use. Mr. Ayat's not here today, but I was just wondering, is that an open core hole well? It's probably, is it possible to do some kind of packer testing? I think it's interesting. I wonder if you see any seasonal variation across that well when it was pumping too, in terms of PFAS.
We did. We used to see in the summer, it seems like when the precipitation would dilute the aquifer, the levels would come down a little bit. It would start creeping down closer to the 12 MCL, and then in the summer, when there's less precipitation recharge, the PFOA levels went up, 20. Actually, I think it peaked a little bit over 20 at around 24 or something at one point. So we do see that seasonal fluctuation. It's a sand and gravel well with a well screen. So there's really no opportunity to do any kind of discrete sampling in any, it's not like a bedrock well that's got discrete fractures. So that's a little bit different there. But yeah, that's what's going on. It seasonally varies, like I said, and it also seems to vary based on not pumping the well continuously. For some reason, seems to drop the PFOA levels in that well.
Must be drawing some layer, some. So follow-up questions, do you see seasonal variation in PFOA levels in your other wells that are continuously pumping?
We do. I don't think anything was extreme as what we see at well 2 for some reason. I think well 2 has one of the higher yields too, so maybe that's got something to do with it. That supplies, I think, over 1/3 of our water in total. So that's got one of the higher yielding. I think that's the highest yielding well that MVD has right now that's in service. So I'm not sure, what the cause of that is, but there is fluctuation in basically all of our wells. But I think well 2 seems to have the most fluctuation from what I remember seeing in the data. Right.
Thank you. The reason I ask is because we're hearing from private well owners a lot of concerns about, variation between them and their neighbors' well, and then variation over time. And, it'd be good if we had some more technical information to be able to say, well, now we know that in the fall, whatever it is,
Right.
whatever the case is, we expect to see higher levels, and make sure that we capture those just to ensure them that we understand what the levels are.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's actually a really good point, Ms. Mesmer. I'll see if Mr. Ayat would be willing to kind of give us a primer on the hydrogeology that might explain how that's happening. Thank you for that. I made a note of it. Are there any? Oh, yes, Ms. Allen.
I think, Dawn, remember back with well 7 and 8, when we first learned about our contamination, they were offline because they had been going through the green sands treatment, I believe, right, for iron and manganese. And I think, wasn't there a pattern there before they were remediated that when they were pumping, they were pulling in more of the plume? And when they weren't pumping, the numbers were down. I think that was there, and that was due to maybe the influence from the Amherst plume, and then the same thing. So, the long and short of it is we have these areas of contamination that are vast, and clearly a well that pumps more is pulling in more PFAS because it's there. It's not going anywhere. But wasn't that a pattern at 7 and 8 a while ago?
Yeah, again, it matches, what we're seeing at well 2 when you don't pump a well continuously, and then you only turn them on for, a short few hours when you collect the monthly samples. There seems to be a lower result when it's just used intermittently like that. So it is what we saw at well 7 and 8. It kind of matches what we saw at well 2. I think the same thing even at wells 4 and 5, when those were offline for years while the treatment plant was being built. When we first turned those on, the levels were quite a bit lower than they were when they were sampled, years ago. But they have kind of crept back up, not as high as they were back in 2016, but the levels has still crept back up. And we are pumping wells 4 and 5. Those were the first ones that came online, a year and a half ago. So that was the only treated water we had. So we kind of made sure we prioritized those wells, and we pumped those, right up to essentially up to almost the limit of the withdrawal, just to make sure that we were putting more treated water into the system as much as possible. And the raw water started coming up in the PFOA levels when we started pumping those wells as well. So it's kind of a pattern we're seeing across the board, essentially, is, when you pump the well more continuously, the levels seem to creep up back to their higher values, or approach their higher values. Yeah.
I just want to take a second to really thank you and to note to the commission and the public that our water commissioners have been immensely involved in this issue for the last few years, and they're not on payroll. They're residents that bring their skills, their time, and their knowledge. Thank you so much, Dawn. I know it's been a real draw on your personal life, but the community really appreciates what you do.
Well, thanks, and I appreciate all the help here. I mean, I think, we've been on various calls. I've been with this commission before, and, there's been a lot of good things that have come out of everyone else helping out too. So what comes around goes around. I appreciate that.
Ms. Murphy.
Thank you. I want to agree with Laureen. I think it's so important for Merrimack residents to know how much work these commissioners are doing to address this. Much of it behind the scenes, fixing things that people don't even realize are happening. I mean, staying on top of the research and options to improve the quality of our water. So I know Don and I were on a call recently, again about options for water lines for Merrimack residents, and talking about rebates for options for this community. So one of the unsung heroes, and I just think it's really important for people to recognize who that our commissioners have the backs of the community here. And so thank you so much, Don, for you and the other commissioners for everything you do.
Well, thank you. And I got to thank DES for always kind of giving us a call and keeping us engaged with all the funding that's available, and the ideas on how we can go for grants and things. And that's what we were just talking about. Was it last week or 2 weeks ago? Trying to provide waterline extensions, MBD waterline extensions to different parts of town that are outside the consent decree, so that there are private wells that are contaminated, and we can try to pick up as many of those private wells with waterline extensions. So we are going to be looking at applying for grants for that work.
Awesome.
Like I said, everyone's helping out on their different perspectives on this, so appreciate it.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Prevention? Yes.
Thank you. Don, several months ago when we met in the environmental subcommittee, you gave us an update on breakthrough and what the experience has been, as well as what the cost has been to MVD. I wonder if you could give us a quick update on that.
Yeah, sure. So at this time, we have not replaced any of our carbon media yet. It looks like we're probably going to have to replace the lead vessel at well 4 and 5, probably at around that 2-year mark. And again, we're currently basing the need for change out on the regulated compounds, and the only regulated compound that exceeds the MCL is PFOA. So that PFOA has broken through the first vessel, and it is coming into the second vessel at this time. So at the point where it creeps up a little bit higher in the second vessel, I think we're looking at when it reaches half or the MCL in the second vessel, then we will, or breaking through the first vessel, I should say, then we're gonna start approaching the replacement time, and MVD is setting that up right now. At the last Board of Commissioners meeting we had, the superintendent Ron Miner was going to start, putting that in process. So that's just the regulated compound PFOA. PFBA was the first compound that we routinely sample for. That was the first compound to break through the first vessel and the second vessel. And that broke through the first vessel after about 8 months. And it has broken through the second vessel now, and that was after just a little bit over a year, or maybe 14 months or so, it had broken through the second vessel. So we are getting leakage of PFBA. It's still in the mid-single digits. There's no regulated value on that. But ironically too, so we're testing for 25 PFAS compounds. We did also, through a grant with DES, and Brandon Kernan was kind of involved in this. He had contacted the MBD and said, hey, there's a special grant available here that the DES secured the funding for testing for 80 PFAS compounds. So we said, yeah, let's do that. We want to see what we're missing, what the 25 compound panel is missing. And sure enough, they did testing on the 80 compound panel, and there was a detection of a compound that's not detected in the 25 panel. That's PFPRA, and that actually had broken through the second vessel as well. So, and I think that in retrospect, it looks like that compound broke through before the PFBA broke through, because it was at a higher level. It almost was like equivalent to the raw water, so there was effectively no removal of PFPRA. I think it removed from 8 down to 7 parts per trillion or something like that. So that tells us that it had broken through, and it was far along on its breakthrough curve where it was almost essentially not being further removed anymore. So we don't really know what other compounds are out there, even beyond the 80 compound panel. It's possible there could always be more. But again, they're not regulated compounds. And the thought process is that at the time, the rest of our wells were not treated, and they were going into the distribution system like wells 2 and 3 previously last summer. So we decided we're going to base our replacement of our media based on the regulated compounds until all of our wells have treatment. Then we're considering proposing a warrant article in March at the annual meeting coming up next year to find out if the ratepayers want to basically pay 3 times the O&M costs to remove the media after 8 months instead of letting it go 2 years. If it goes 2 years, you're going to have breakthrough of the non-regulated compounds. if you want to remove all of the compounds that we measure, you're going to have to basically remove the media, replace the media at 8 months. I don't have a good projected cost on that yet because we haven't actually paid to have the media replaced yet, but I want to say it's going to be something over 100,000, and it depends on what you add into those costs, right? If you got the labor of the staff, the disposal, the trucking, all that stuff together, you know, you're over $100,000. If it's just the cost of the media, you know, I think you're at something a little bit under $100,000. You know, but when you start looking at all of our 3 treatment plants that we're going to have, that's where that $400,000 annual number was coming from when you look at all of our treatment plants together. If in fact we are going to change the media out when the first PFAS that we measure breaks through, which is PFBA, you know, you'd be looking at an 8-month replacement frequency, because that's about the time where you start getting breakthrough of that PFBA compound.
And just one follow-up, Don, when do you go, can you tell us when the 80 test of the 80 was done?
I want to say that was at the beginning of the year. Lorraine, do you remember, you were involved with that sampling as well, right? The PFPRA, when that showed up. One or two, there were 2 rounds.
July. I think,
Yeah, I think
we
there
were
were 2
talking about
rounds.
PFPRA. We were talking about that, and we retested for PFPRA the beginning of this year. But the
Right.
80 panel, I believe, was July of last summer. So
Right.
it's complex, as we can see from hearing you. You know, as ratepayers and residents, they're impacted. We're paying for what we did not cause. Right.
Right. Yeah, so we did a follow-up on that, just to be clear. The first round was back last year, as Lorraine mentioned, and we wanted to confirm. I think we got a really high number at one of the, I think at your residence, Lorraine, was like 40 or something, 42, and that just seemed to really confuse everybody about where that is that really real? And I think it was followed up with a lower number, but it's still present, you know. So that's why we did 2 rounds there. We wanted to confirm what we saw in the first round, and it was still confirmed to be present, not quite as high as that number, but it was still present. So you always kind of wonder what else is out there, because we don't really know what the companies are using, the PFAS users. We don't really know what they're using, so it's kind of hard to know what to test for.
The fluctuations are troubling, especially in an unregulated contaminant, because we all know PFOA is our primary exposure, and it has been historically. That's undisputed. The PFPRA from my raw water on the outside spigot was 4 times the PFOA, and that was really stunning to me when I thought about what that meant to myself, my family, and community members. And it was really a stunning find. So the recheck in the winter was lower, but it was still there. And as you said, it looks like our media may not be taking it out at all or minimally. So that's an issue that is not on the radar of the nation. Looking up PFPRA, I did discover that for people who are following what these are, it's what's called a C3. It's a shorter chain PFAS, and it's a replacement for PFOA. It also is found in bottled drinking water, and when they test for it in large, we don't read those numbers. The highest significance in most cases. So it's there, and no one really knows it. So in every PFAS, when you look up the health effects, they're very similar. The liver, the, blah, 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 all the stuff with the lab rats, and it's very, very similar in that PFOA family. So, it's not going to go away. We're doing a really good job, and everybody has all hands on deck. But when we look at this from an exposure perspective, we still have many unanswered questions and some work to go. And I hate to say it, but my suspicion is that, when we look at the lead lag GAC, I don't think it's the be all end all. I think there's some add-ons we're going to find out in the future as we learn more and more. And whatever the EPA says in the fall for their rulemaking, they're hinting it could be more than the legacy ones. So we'll see.
Well,
It's
on
troubling.
that,
It's complicated.
I know Mindy's got a question. I just wanted to jump in because it's timely. Is at wells 4 and 5, the treatment plant, when that was being built, we asked them to give us an area of the treatment plant that we're going to install some test columns in there, and we'll be able to use that treatment plant to do our own testing. And a couple of the things that I want to have tested is to see how anion resin works at removing those short chains. So we're gonna build some test columns in there. We'll be able to take some of the raw water from wells 4 and 5, run it through those test columns, and then take samples. And we'll come up with a testing program that's gonna basically be able to develop breakthrough curves, and so that we can apply that to the large scale system. So I'm putting this notice out to you now because you guys are well plugged into the different facets that I'm not covering. If there's any grant money that you ever hear available for that kind of testing, I'd certainly be interested in having MBD take a look at that, because by having the apparatus in our own property, we're going to save money and not have to use some other testing lab to do the actual physical test setup. We could set the test up ourselves and have our own staff collect samples. But obviously, when you're testing for PFAS, I think we're paying about $325 or something a sample here. And we're going to be collecting samples when we do these tests on multiple columns. So we're going to be testing different media side by side all at the same time, taking multiple tests maybe every few weeks, every month or so. The cost of the sampling is going to be a significant cost in that whole study. So if we can get grant money to do that instead of having this, cover all that ourselves, and we're just beginning to kind of put together this test protocol. We actually authorized Underwood Engineers to work with us to develop a test procedure. So we're going to try and test things. We're even going to maybe look at testing that zeolite that was presented to us years ago, possibly different carbon media to see if the other carbon media out there will work better. But I definitely want to look at anion resin, because I'm using anion resin in my own business for small water systems. And when I looked into the research on it, you get a much longer run time on the anion resin, so you don't need to replace it as often. It's more costly, but you need to use about a third of it. So your less volume that you're buying, it's more expensive. But if it lasts longer, that's kind of what we want to do. And I think over in peas, they're using a combination of carbon and anion resin. So if that's where we need to go on this to give us longer run times, and if it's ultimately less costly, less O&M cost to bring some anion resin into the treatment mix, that's something we want to better understand. So the good news is we've equipped wells 4 and 5 with the ability to kind of do our own testing like that. So getting the funding to pay for the sampling is something that we're definitely going to be looking into.
Ms. Mesmer?
Thank you. So I wondered if you would be able to share with us the 80 compound list results that you received earlier on. And then I just wanted to comment, great, that would be awesome, because I've been really looking at, the RTO and all this stuff. And so it'd be helpful to see that. I share your concern because, as you know, when EPA ORD came out, they found 180 PFAS compounds coming out of those stacks. And the bigger the list of compounds analyzed for, especially when if you're going to look at this resin treatment, would be better. Just so you know, going down the road, we'll have a little bit more information than just a short list of PFAS compounds. I'm sure you know that. But yes, they are using resin. In one system at Pease are using it as a pre-treatment, and the other one they're using it as a post-treatment, I believe. So there's a lot of data there available. It's a slightly different, of course, is AFFF, but a suggestion would be, there's a man, and I can't remember his last name, Lorraine probably knows, Chris something from Colorado School of Mines, came out and did some sampling at Pease the broader list of compounds. And, you know, while some may only be qualitative, it still might be helpful in looking at appropriate treatment and what's actually in that water that maybe we don't know about.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I can send
Chris
that off.
Higgins, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, are there any other questions for Mr. Preventure? I have a few. Don, you said your MVD is purchasing water from Pennachuck. Is there the source of their water, surface or well? Is it all surface from?
It's all surface water, and actually they're prioritizing the Merrimack River right now, and I think they have been for the last couple years. They were using Pennachuck Brook, as you know, but Pennachuck Brook is fed by Witches Brook, which originates over in Amherst by where the contamination is. Witches Brook flows right by well 7 and 8. MVD was well 7 and 8. And so Witches Brook is being impacted by the Amherst contamination, which feeds into Pennachuck Brook. I think they were having levels in Pennachuck Brook between like 20 and 40 parts per trillion of PFOA. So the river is in the single digits. Merrimack River is in single digits PFOA. So Pennachuck built an intake, and they were taking water from the river, and that puts less of a load on their carbon beds. So in surface water treatment, and Mike, jump in if I have any of this wrong, because you probably know the system over there pretty well as well. But surface waters treat their water with sand beds. So my understanding is Pennachuck put a layer of carbon in those sand beds as well to help reduce the PFOA levels that were coming in when they were using Pennachuck Brook. So they're also still using those carbon sand beds. And by using the river, the thought was that the lower concentration of PFOA in the river was going to extend the life of the carbon that's in the sand beds. In talking with Pennachuck, they have indicated that the surprise that happened to them was that the river supposedly had different organics or more organics in it. So some of those organics were kind of consuming the carbon media as well. So it's a bit of a trade-off there where, you know, by using the least PFOA concentration water in the river, that water is actually still kind of, you know, exhausting the carbon sand beds as well. But my understanding is that they're prioritizing the Merrimack River. The low concentration of the PFAS in that river is working out well, and they're kind of trying to do their own testing and find where the best performance is as far as the trade-off between the organics and the PFOA levels. But we are purchasing water. We went to the PUC for a reduced rate. I want to say it's something in the order of like 62 cents or something per 100 cubic feet. You know, and if we were buying that retail without the reduced rate, the temporary reduced rate, we would be looking at a number that's I think over like $3.50 per 100 cubic feet or something. And in the past, MVD was paying that. We were using Pennachuck just as a backup emergency supply when we needed it. But now we're essentially maximizing that. We can use up to 1 million gallons a day from Pennachuck. That's what the pumping capacity we have there. So we're prioritizing that first. We're making sure that we're using, if we need it. We haven't really needed it up until recently, but if we need it, we'll take the full 1 million gallons a day from Pennachuck first, and then we're only going to turn well 2 on if we can't keep up with the 1 million gallons of Pennachuck that we're taking from there. And now, as you know, that we've got well 4 and 5 on, we got well 7 and 8 on too. So that kind of took some of the burden off. We're still more, I don't want to use the word profitable because MVD doesn't really make profit, but we're still making more money by using our own sources when we can. But we've got a significantly reduced rate through the PUC, and that's only going to run until the end of the year. The thought process was as soon as the treatment at well 2 and 9, as soon as that comes on by the end of the year, then we're going to go back to being self-sufficient. And at that point, that temporary rate reduction is going to be expired.
Okay, so if we were asked by constituents, what is the quality of water coming out of the tap from MVD? Is it pretty consistent now throughout the town? I know when the PFAS treatment at 4 and 5 went online, those folks that drew from the north part of town were a little more advantaged just because the mix favored them. But would you say that everything coming out of MVD now is within the MCLs?
Yeah, it should be, because we don't have well 2 on as long as Pennachuck is below the MCL, and we are sampling. We've actually included that sample at the interconnect pump station in our monthly sampling. So we're collecting monthly samples there just so we know what's coming in from Pennachuck. I think you're still seeing basically non-detect water over in the northeast portion of town, because again, that's preferentially being supplied by the treated water at wells 4 and 5. On the southwest side, which water coming from basically Hollis from wells 7 and 8, that's non-detect as well. But that's also where the Pennachuck interconnection is. So that's mixing with the Pennachuck water. But the Pennachuck water's been, in the single digits basically for most of the time. So when you mix with that, you're still going to get water that's probably less than 5 parts per trillion of PFOA. There was a little hiccup too, I should mention, in February. If you remember, we actually had some really, really cold weather for a few weeks in February. That caused a problem in the intake, a temporary problem with the intake of water from Nashua in the Pennachuck system. It was some ice crystals or something that were forming in the intake pipe that were kind of clogging the intake pipe, to make it a simple explanation. So they actually had to go back and start taking water from the Pennachuck Brook again, which has higher levels of PFOA in it than the river, as I explained before. And that kind of seemed to overload their carbon beds. It occurred at a time where their carbon beds needed to be changed out. So it was just bad timing, where the additional PFOA load passed through the carbon bed. And we actually did detect water in the sample that was in the interconnect from Pennachuck in February. I think we got a sample that tested at like 13 parts per trillion for PFOA. So it was technically just barely over, the 12 PFOA limit. But that was only for a couple of weeks. The weather changed and they were able to go back to the river. And once they used the river seems to be pretty consistently below double digits. So it's compliant. It's essentially, the river water is typically compliant with PFOA in its raw water state.
Okay, and thank you, Don. I have another question. Probably Mr. Wimsatt might be able to answer this one, but the PFPRA, is that a raw material of Saint-Gobain? Has they given DES like a list of all of their PFAS that they use in their process? I'm just wondering the source of that, if that's in a raw material, or maybe I don't know.
Our air division certainly has a lot of information about the raw materials that are used, and that's something we could take up. I'm not sure the answer to that specific question. There's a lot of confusion about the PFPRA. There's a lot of work that's gone on that Brandon Kernan is very familiar with. I'm not quite as familiar with it, but I think maybe it would be helpful to kind of help put some context on that. Maybe at the next meeting, I can either get information, or we could have Brandon talk about that. I apologize. I've been trying to kind of break in here because I have to leave this meeting in about 10 minutes. And I wanted to thank you for starting the meeting at 9 on my behalf, so that I could, but I'm starting, my clock's starting to run out. So.
Okay. Mr. Preventer, if you wouldn't mind hanging around, I have one more question, but I don't want to lose Mr. Wimsatt either. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. Go ahead.
Yeah. Mr. Wimsatt, would you like to go ahead and give an update from DES before you depart?
Yes, I would love to do that. And actually, as part of that, I was going to have John Patali start. You may recall that last time there was a request to have him come and speak about some of these unregulated compounds, how we're monitoring those, and what we know about, as information and health information develops on those compounds. But I think what I'd like to do is I'll go ahead and give as brief a presentation as I can, and then I'll turn it over to John to give his presentation about that. He probably only has about 5 or 10 minutes on that, if that works okay for the chair.
Yep, sounds great.
Okay, so as far as DES's update goes, as we discussed at the last meeting, we had announced on April 18th that we'd entered into an agreement with Saint-Gobain for the provision of alternate water for homes located within the consent decree area. And at that time, I went over about 353 homes for which specific remedies were proposed, either water lines or POET connections. And then as part of that agreement, they were also required to provide a proposal by the end of April for an additional 650 homes, which they did do. And I'd hope that we're still reviewing that. We still have a little bit of work we're doing to try to come to agreement on that proposal. So unfortunately, I thought by now we'd be able to announce what that was, but it's gonna be a little bit longer. I think it's gonna be coming soon. I think we're gonna get to closure on that fairly soon, but I don't have an update for this meeting. I also mentioned at the last meeting that on May 4th, we'd issued a comment letter pertaining to Addendum 14 and the proposal for sampling. And in that, we had indicated that we also wanted them to include properties that were within the buffered areas where they had, in their view, there was a potential alternate source. And so they weren't proposing to sample in those buffered areas, as well as just some homes that are not necessarily in buffered areas, but aren't currently within 500 feet of a known exceedance, so of another well that's been tested above standards. We asked them to include all those wells in their proposal. We did receive by early June a proposal. It's not complete. It does include a number of additional wells, particularly around the Bedford fire station, the Hudson landfill, that they had not originally proposed. But we're still in the process of reviewing that, and we'll be able to give you an update on that at the next meeting. As far as water supply sampling well statistics, which I usually provide at each of these, Saint-Gobain has not provided a new update on that since our last meeting. So the numbers I have, and as always, the clerk here will get a copy of my talking points here with this information. But basically, in the interest of time, I won't go over those numbers. They're the same numbers that I presented at the last meeting. They will be contained in the information that I provide to the clerk, so that they can be included in the minutes, but they're not different. Obviously, that they have not included this addendum 15 that was proposed. So once we get an update from Saint-Gobain that includes addendum 15, there'll be new numbers. As far as the site investigation goes, their consultant will be conducting the stormwater sampling this spring. I don't believe that's quite happened yet, but I think that should be happening soon if it hasn't happened. And then, of course, we have requested that a remedial action plan is due to be submitted after that stormwater sampling data is received. So that trigger date will be 120 days from the date that they get their stormwater sampling data. Also, the groundwater management permit application, which is a proposal to do long-term monitoring of drinking water wells and monitoring wells associated with the site, is due to us by August 26th. So we expect to be meeting with them to discuss that. This is, of course, a groundwater management permit that would be unlike any other we've ever administered. So we want to have some initial meetings with them to discuss the scope of that and how they're going to approach that. And the other thing I want to mention before I give the Air Division's update is that I did mention last time we are planning to stand up a rebate program for folks whose wells are above the standard, who are outside the consent decree area and wouldn't be getting an offer of alternate water from Saint-Gobain. I'm happy to say that the $5 million award from the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund that we received approval for from the Advisory Commission a few months back is going before both Governor and Council and the Fiscal Committee next week. It's on the agenda for both of those meetings. So we can't presuppose anything, but it's provided that that is approved by both Governor and Council and the Fiscal Committee. We hope to be launching that program as promptly as possible. We're shooting for having that ready and to go and taking applications by the end of the summer. And we'll have, at our next meeting, we'll have an update on how we're doing on that. And as far as the Air Division's updates go, I've been given a pretty comprehensive update from Kathy Beam, which I'm going to read. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, so when you see it in the minutes, it'll look a little more different. But I'm going to try to provide it here to you, just so that folks understand what's going on. So Kathy's provided an update, which provides that on May 31st, DES issued a letter of closure regarding the letter of deficiency that was sent to Saint-Gobain back in November of last year regarding the installation and use of the emergency bypass stack. And in that letter of closure, DES stated the following. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but it's mostly a quote. Compliance with the LOD has been achieved for LOD items 1 through 4 and 6. DES issues this letter of compliance for those items and provides notice to Saint-Gobain that item 5 of the LOD is a requirement of the permit, and that DES disagrees with Saint-Gobain's interpretation that bypass events do not qualify as excess emissions requiring permit deviation reporting. Please be advised that DES will continue to monitor Saint-Gobain's compliance status, including the requirement to report permit deviations as per the requirements of specific citations in the rules of the permit and of the permit. This letter does not provide relief against any existing or future violations and refers only to the compliance issues addressed in the LOD. DES reserves the right to pursue administrative fines or civil penalties for the violations noted in the letter of deficiency. This matter is still an open referral, and that's the end of the quote from the letter. Now, this matter is still an open referral to the AG's office for enforcement. Saint-Gobain has continued to submit monthly monitoring plan reports as required in their temporary permit and rainwater study results as required in the consent decree. These documents can be found, and there'll be links in the text that I provide to the clerk under the general correspondence tab in One Stop. The most recent monthly monitoring plan letter from Saint-Gobain is dated May 12th. The most recent rainwater study letter is dated April 29th and reflects samples taken in April. So I did discuss the results of these samples during the April meeting, but I'll quickly review them again here as Kathy has provided them. For the Concord rainwater sample, 3 PFAS analytes were reported, PFBA at 5.9, PFHXA at 4.7, these units are part per trillion, and PFPEA at 2.1. For the Nashua sample, 1 PFAS analyte was reported, PFHXA at 2.6. And for the Merrimack sample, 3 PFAS analytes were reported, PFHXA at 8, PFBA at 5.2, and PFPEA at 3.8. DES discussed the last 2 months of rainwater data results with Saint-Gobain's consultant, Golder, who is conducting the sampling. Golder acknowledged that during the March and April rainwater sampling events, the sampling team had expanded to 2 employees instead of the customary 1 employee deploying and preparing the sampling equipment. Golder is reviewing any issues with technique. Golder acknowledged that samples were consistent across all 3 locations in March, and that there was an issue with HPFODA, that's Gen X, essentially the dimer acid, in the method blank for the April sampling round. DES has requested that Golder notify DES before the next sampling round in order to accompany them to the Merrimack and Concord rainwater sampling locations during deployment and collection. On June 1st, Saint-Gobain, through their consultant CT Mail, submitted a permit renewal application for the devices covered by the temporary permit. In accordance with the New Hampshire administrative rules, applications for state permits to operate are due to DES 90 days prior to the expiration date of a device's existing temporary permit. So the temporary permit is scheduled to expire on August 31st, and DES will be completing a completeness review of the application within 30 days of receipt as required under the law. So that's, I apologize, it's pretty dense, but I wanted to just read that into the record here. And again, all of that text will be provided with appropriate links to the documents in the notes that I provide to the clerk for this.
Thank you,
and
Mr. Wimsatt. I don't mean to break in quick, but Mr. Badazian is the clerk today.
Oh, okay, great. So I will forward that to you, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you.
And at this point, I do need to take my leave very shortly here. I'd be happy to take a question or two, and then I'd probably like to turn it over to John Vitale.
Ms. Mesmer?
Thank you. So you said that at the very end, you said the temporary permit. I think I missed the beginning of that. Does that mean the air permit?
Yes.
So at that point, will DES reevaluate the number of PFAS compounds that are regulated in the permit to comply with the new state standards for the additional 2 compounds?
Yes, I think I don't want to commit to that because I'm not the air expert, but that's my understanding. Yes, it couldn't be.
Okay.
It wasn't included in the original temporary permit because they weren't in place yet. But now that they're in place, I would expect that they would be included in this permit review.
Okay, and follow-up question on another issue. So at the beginning, I'm very happy to see that there has been some movement in Saint-Gobain's accepting responsibility for areas within the consent decree that were previously denied. Especially we've been, as you know, talking to people in Bedford near the fire station. And from those residents, they were denied any coverage whatsoever as of even the end of May for this issue. So many of them have gone out and collected their own samples. They've even bought bottled water, or perhaps they've even installed a system in the last few months because they were tired of waiting for the problem to be fixed. So I wondered, and many of those people are asking me, what do I do now? So some have decided that they've spent money on sampling and they've gone to Saint-Gobain requesting reimbursement. So I wondered where that all stood. So the residents in this area that were previously denied sampling are now going to be afforded sampling by Saint-Gobain, correct?
I think the answer is in part. I don't think it's a complete reversal. I don't believe that they proposed sampling all those residents inside that particular buffered area, but they have proposed some. So this is still, as far as DES is concerned, this is still not reconciled to our satisfaction.
But the list that they provided in to you, those homes will be sampled, right?
Right. I don't see
on the list. Okay.
We wouldn't approve that proposal, certainly.
Okay. So the process for these homeowners would be go to Saint-Gobain again and say, we want you to sample, we want bottled water, et cetera, at this point?
Again, we're working on trying to get all those samples, those folks sampled inclusively. That's in process, so I don't want to talk too much about our strategy on that, but that's something we're still working on. But certainly, when all is said and done, if these folks don't get, if they're tested one way or another and they are above standards and they don't get an offer of alternative water from Saint-Gobain or from any other party, then they would be eligible for the rebate program.
Okay, Dr. Bush.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I was just going to ask real quick, Mike, are folks eligible for retroactive reimbursement if they fall under that eligibility?
The eligibility for this program, I believe, goes back to September of 19 when we first imposed the new standards via rule. So yes, and I apologize, I'm really running over here, so I'm going to have to take my leave. But I'd like to, and I'll leave it. It's obviously at the chair's pleasure. But if you'd like to have John Vitale come on to speak now, I think he's been queued up. So
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Wimsatt.
all right, thank you all. Take care.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Vitale, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. I'm in my cubicle today, so there might be some background noise. Sorry about that in case that happens. So I'm going to give just an update on what's going on with some of the PFAS risk assessment work. And in order to do this, I made just one slide to share. So I'm going to ask Amy if she can promote me to presenter or give me whatever godlike power I need to share my screen. Hey, look at that. I can screen share. Okay. Let me see. Oh, it's not showing me which screen I am sharing. Hold on.
That was just not presenter view, John.
I see. Hold on. I'm trying to remember which one of these buttons gives me no to your screen. Click here to start screen sharing.
We did see a flash of a slide.
Nope. Do you see a picture of a dog right now?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Do you see a slide? There we go.
Yep.
Okay, I'm sure my screen probably gave everyone anxiety when they saw my organization.
I know. Made me
Okay.
feel better.
Okay, so can you see the presentation version? Is there a PowerPoint slide up right now?
Yes.
No, you're in your presenter
It's
view though. Maybe
presenter
go to display. Yeah. And
Okay,
swap,
display settings. This is so much fun.
duplicate. Or I duplicate, but yeah.
There you go.
Now we can see it.
Okay, okay, there we go. So this is just going to be a brief update on what's going on sort of at the EPA level and some of the things that we're tracking here in the DES program. So the first thing that many of you are probably aware of is EPA is in the process of setting MCLs for PFOA and PFOS. As a part of that, they had to redo their risk assessment for those two compounds. That was released back in November. It has been going through its Science Advisory Board review process. Their EPA is currently reviewing those comments and feedback that they got from the Science Advisory Board. And it looks like they'll be proposing MCLs later this year, probably in the late summer, early fall, somewhere around that time frame. So with that being an MCL, they're also going to have to go through their cost-benefit analysis and their rulemaking on whatever numbers that they propose. So with that, there is talk that they may be issuing a series of either interim or short-term health advisories that may or may not be coming out sometime over the summer or late spring. So with those two compounds, that's an actual MCL process. Now, with some of the other compounds that they're looking at, there's PFBS and Gen X. Those have been reviewed and they have what we call reference doses. So that is what we need to develop guidance or screening values. So for those compounds, EPA has finalized the reference dose component, but they have not recommended any health advisories yet for those compounds. So just a reminder, a health advisory is a non-enforceable EPA value. It's used for screening or recommending when people may want to consider certain health options, but they've not recommended anything for those yet. They have stated several times that they are going to put something out in the spring of 2022. We're getting close to the end of the spring of 2022, so we're expecting something soon. In general, though, with those two compounds, for PFBS, really looking at the range of numbers that can be developed using the information that EPA has put out, it's really ranging from somewhere up to about 1,000 to 2,000 parts per trillion, whereas Gen X is possibly a number that's in a similar ballpark of what we currently have for regulations around the 4 PFAS that New Hampshire has MCLs for. When we actually look at a lot of the data from across the state, though, for these compounds, neither of those numbers and those ranges will really trigger any action where we already have action being taken because of the existing 4 MCLs. So even though health advisories may be coming out, there's sort of a question in our case because the amount of data that we have, it's not really going to catch new places. So for other compounds that are a little bit further down the road, there is PFBA, which I know folks are talking about earlier on this meeting, and PFHXA. So EPA is developing toxicity values for those right now, and they are currently under review by their science advisory boards. So those numbers may or may not change depending on how EPA responds to peer review by outside scientists who are not at EPA. So likely when those come out, they would follow a similar process of PFBS and Gen X and possibly have health advisories issued down the road. And then finally, there's 3 other compounds that EPA is looking at just based on which ones do we actually have decent data for. And that's PFHXS, PFNA, and PFDA. So that's the 10 carbon, so slightly longer, kind of similar to PFNA. And EPA is also trying to figure out what grouping tools may or may not work for PFAS. So all of these are still under development, and they should be coming out as drafts or basically going to public comment and review somewhere between 2022 and 2024. That is the tentative timeline for EPA. I think as we all know, especially over the last 2 years since 2020, if weird things happen, then it may redirect their efforts and that may change these timelines. So as far as what the DES Environmental Health Program is doing, one of the things is we are tracking these and we're reviewing any of the draft documents that are coming out, trying to review and follow and understand what science EPA is picking and not picking. But one of the things we're trying to focus on too is understanding as we have more values that we can actually adopt with looking at drinking water values, also how does this apply to other media? So we're trying to understand how to apply for risk assessment at impacted sites, at Superfund sites, just trying to understand how does this impact other areas and what other tools should we be using for screening. So with that, that's really my brief update, and I can open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patali. Are there any questions from commission members? I have one. Thank you for the update on what action's being done on specific PFAS compounds, but do you get a sense from EPA if they're taking more of a bird's eye view about regulation as a class?
Yeah, so that's where the grouping tools comes in. And really the issue that EPA is running into is there's the upstream component of what's being authorized and going onto the market and are being used in products and what's being okay for companies to use. And then there's the actual issue of where do we do risk assessments at? Where do we reduce people's exposures after this has been on the market for years and it's in the environment? Where are we going to throw resources to reduce risk? And the problem is grouping doesn't work across both those domains. You can't have the same grouping approach. And that's one of the reasons EPA has been struggling for the last years to come up with something. And what it's looking more like is it may be that within those two domains, so there's different grouping approaches, but even within that, they may be coming up with different recommendations on how to do grouping for risk assessment. And they may actually come up with different methods for certain media. Because one of the issues that they are running into is qualitatively, yes, certain PFAS share similar health endpoints, but quantitatively, that doesn't match up. So it's running into this challenge of how do you deal with differences in risk when you're talking about like assessment of a site versus when you're talking about regulating a class of compounds that are coming on the market and how do they do screening for what compounds they approve. So ultimately, it's really looking more and more like it's not going to be a simple thing of all PFAS are the same upstream and downstream. It's probably going to be this thing where they're breaking it down into different areas of regulation, have different grouping approaches.
Are you aware of any discussion or action on EPA in pursuing defined essential use?
Not to my knowledge, and that's something that the EPA action plan sort of outlines how they're trying to approach topics like that. But to my knowledge, it's really sort of in the same stage as the grouping approach, where it's a lot of questioning, what is that essential use? How do we define that? And I don't really expect something to come out quickly.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mesmer?
Thanks for that update, Jonathan. But so that's a lot of EPA info. Our neighbors, Vermont and Massachusetts, have found their way to regulate some of these, especially PFBA and PHXA, and wondered how that fits into the calculus because they've done so successfully. So just wondered. I mean, I know it's always the fallback position to look at what EPA is doing, but EPA isn't known to be super proactive on actually coming to decisions on these. So, where we already have active known exposure to these chemicals in New Hampshire, I just wondered if, I know DES opposed our efforts this year to add those to the list, or two of those, and then another one to the list that was breaking through in Merrimack. So could you update us on that and how those other states have found their way to? You're muted.
There we go. So for PFHXA, one of the things that has been challenging is both PFHXA and PFBA do not have the same half-lives as the other compounds. So from a risk assessment standpoint, like from our program's view, it's really hard to say that they have the same level of toxicity as the other compounds. For Massachusetts, with the longer chain compounds, they did some modeling where they came to the conclusion that they're similar. They didn't have data for PFHXA, so they just included it as a policy decision. So that wasn't really a science, that wasn't a risk assessment calculation that got down to that number. That was a sort of policymakers making a decision there. And that's something that for our program, we do risk assessments. So we have to follow the data and what evidence is available to us. Similar with PFBA, EPA has been undergoing research with this. We also know that there are other studies coming out, and that's one of the reasons that we're trying to follow to see where is EPA's final PFBA number going to come out relative to some of these newer studies that have been found. And we're wanting to rely on that if we're going to make any kinds of recommendations. So that's one of the reasons that we haven't just been following with, as soon as there is something out there, we're going to jump on it, because even with other states that have looked at regulating PFBA, really, when you look at the risk assessment piece, it's like PFBS. You're up in the high hundreds to thousands is where we would expect to see risk from that compound. So it's not really going to add an immediate action at sites where we already have action being taken over PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, or PFNA.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Ms. Mesmer, are you all set? Okay. Oh, yes, Mr. Preventure.
Yeah, I just had a quick follow-up on that PFBA. Laureen had provided a copy of the ERG's report, external panel peer review of EPA's draft IRIS toxicological review of PFBA and related salts. It was issued on May 24th. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that or not, but I haven't. But I was just curious if you had looked at it, what your thoughts were. Does it change any understanding of the toxicity of PFBA in your perspective? I don't know if you even had a chance to review it yet or not.
Yeah, so with PFBA, really one of the big sticking issues, and this is something that hasn't really, the Science Advisory Board that has met over the PFBA recommendation by EPA, it was a public meeting. It was something that those comments were submitted as a part of that. So that was something that was reviewed in that process. There's a whole packet online that contains comments from that group, comments from other groups. That's one of the things, like, we sort of have to track everyone's comments and see what's going on. One of the big issues around, it's one of the things that's very much debated around PFBA is how bioaccumulative it is, because with a lot of the PFAS that we regulate right now, the thing that drives the numbers being in the teens for parts per trillion is how cumulative these are. And one of the big arguments that a lot of these groups are trying to make is that, well, actually PFBA is accumulative because it just accumulates in different tissues. And that was all based on a single study from Spain that looked at some human cadavers and found high levels of PFBA in lung and kidney tissue. But last year, and there's actually some more studies getting ready to come out, have found that it was very likely that that detection of high levels in those tissues was an artifact of a natural fatty acid. Sorry, one second. Sorry, there's a rowdy cubicle. So as I was saying, there's sort of this issue with PFBA and understanding how accumulative it is, because it might actually just be an artifact of natural fatty acids in the body that older methods mistake for being PFBA. And we're seeing that with some other PFAS compounds. We're looking at different matrices where it's not actually the compound, it's something else that's mimicking that. So, you know, if PFBA is not as accumulative as the other compounds, it's just going to end up being higher because it doesn't stay in the body long enough to cause an internal dose that can result in harm.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Dr. Vitale? Yeah, Ms. Allen?
Just a comment to just put it on record. My concern with all the debates is, of course, there's parties that arguing that have a stake in it, right? And they have to kill this issue no matter what, because it's not good for them. So PFBA, yes, the half-life is definitively shorter, and that comes into a lot of the exposure assessments. What we see in North Carolina, even when they did urine and blood samples of the shorter chain, and some of the things down there that we don't even test for here that are different because the manufacturer, Chamois, is a different process. So people were surprised to not see some of these things in their human sampling. And when I looked at that, I thought, well, regardless of the half-life, we have to keep in mind, as Dawn has presented, as the Air Division has presented, as the precipitation testing, the water testing, everything shows in our environment, we have a steady exposure. Even though there's an RTO that has not eliminated, it's reduced, right? PFAS. We have remediation in our water, but we know we have breakthrough of short chain chemicals, and we know we have mysterious ones that aren't even in a normal panel showing up in my house, So the issue to me is we have a community that is exposed to a mixture of PFAS. We're counting them individually, and PFBA in particular, we have a constant, steady exposure to. So I wonder about that. I think about the half-life and the way we scientifically figure things out. I hear it and I understand it and it makes sense logically. But then I say, how does that pertain to me and my family and my neighbors and my community? And then I get stuck on this. Well, we have this steady flow on a daily basis in the air, in the rain, in the soil, in our water, even though our water is remediated, and in, who knows, consumer products, local goods, it's everywhere. So that's the problem, what we're looking at the EPA, and I understand what the state is doing and their process, risk assessment makes sense, right? But keep in mind, I don't know if you think, what's your opinion on how does half-life translate into steady exposure? If we have short-term limited exposure, our body's going to clear this, hopefully, though I have read those autopsy studies for many years and they're very troubling. So, that's the sticking point. How do we get those two things together? I mean, what do you think about, or constant steady exposure, which really to me isn't captured by half-life? Am I wrong in thinking half-life to me kind of says if you're exposed and you stop your exposure, half-life kind of applies? All right, what happened? How does this impact me? What can I expect? But we haven't stopped the exposure. Am I making sense? It's just, it doesn't hit
Right.
together with me.
Right. So the thing is, like, it's not a matter of so let's say you have a steady exposure to anything. You are going to build up to a certain level in your body, but half-life doesn't kick in once you stop exposure. Half-life is constantly at play. So that's the thing with PFBA, where what's going to happen is if you have a steady exposure, it's going to build up for PFBA, PFHXS, any compound, arsenic, pick anything. If you have a steady exposure to any chemical, it's going to build up to a certain steady state in the body, a certain amount that your body can accommodate of that chemical for whatever biological reason or whatever mechanism that chemical gets transported in the body. But there's always going to be a rate that it's leaking back out, and that's the half-life. The idea of totally stopping your exposure and then saying, okay, what's the half-life doing now? That's where you're saying, okay, what's the maximum amount that can be eliminated once you stop that exposure? So the issue with like the long chain PFAS is because they have such a long half-life, they can build up and they will stay elevated for a long time and they slowly come back out. With PFBA, the half-life is on order of days to weeks, depending on which study you're looking at. It seems like it's cleared, so you can never build up to the same level in the body that you can with the long chains. It's just really hard to do that unless you're in an occupational setting where, you are just around huge amounts of this stuff and you don't have any protection. So that's one of the things where the half-life is always there. You're always eliminating some amount of it. It's just a matter of what's the rate of what's coming in versus what's the rate that's leaving. And with shorter half-lives, you need a much higher rate coming in to build that up in the body. And that's one of the reasons why when we look at these models, when we look at those assumptions of constant exposure, because again, that's what this idea of PFBA and what EPA is looking at with these reference doses, it is doing that. It's asking the question of what happens if someone is constantly exposed to this. EPA is not developing acute numbers. Those would be the numbers that we say, well, if you're exposed for 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, like those acute short-term numbers are not how we're assessing risk. And that's not how EPA is doing that right now. They are looking at it from that thing of assuming someone is getting a steady, constant exposure. And that's the same thing that we do when we develop these advisories. we're not assuming that there's variation. So the variation that Don was talking about earlier, where it seems to go up and seems to go down, there might be seasonality. We take a conservative assumption. We assume that's not happening. We assume that you don't have a day off. We assume that you never go to another drinking water system. That's one of the things, like the idea of that constant exposure and what does it take to reduce that is built into the risk assessment process.
What I think is not built in, and maybe not to medicine in general, is for me, my body is taking in whatever it's taking in, a mixture of PFAS any way I cut it in one way or another. Now my body has to excrete it. My body has to figure out how to protect itself and what to do. So, we have immense complaints here with people who have mysterious ailments and immune issues and things like that. So my concern from a health perspective is we are constantly under siege, to be dramatic about it. That's the phrase that comes to mind. And we're in our bodies have this burden that we're constantly trying to decrease. So the burden of the exposure challenges the body. And I worry about that because I think that really does challenge our cells and our neurological systems. And, we have COVID and we have everything else. So it's something to really keep in mind. What does it mean to the average person who's having this steady exposure, because we can't fully stop the source because we're waiting for the definitive science to be there. So we just have to keep that in mind. I tell people all the time, regardless of what the numbers is, what's coming in publicly, get the dedicated RO for $200, put that in your kitchen, and please use that. I tell them that, and I said, then you will be safer.
Okay, I want to move us along, unless anybody has any pressing questions. Dr. Patali, I really want to thank you very much for meeting with us today and sharing this information, making yourself available. But I do want to it's kind of a strange meeting because now I want to go back to MVD. I have just a question for Mr. And Dr. Patali, you're welcome to stay. Oh, good, he left. Okay, that's fine. So, Don, I have one other question of you, and then you can go on to your day if you want. But
Sure.
when you were mentioning that MVD is taking over their testing, so are you using the EPA test for PFAS, or is it like an LC mass spec or LC with some other detection capability?
No, it's still the same. We're still using outside testing labs, the Eurofins. It's still the same testing. What I was talking about is if you're referring to what I was talking about with our own test columns in the Wells 4 and 5 treatment plant, we're going to be running our own sort of experiments. But part of those experiments, we're going to be collecting samples and running them to the lab for testing. It's the same testing we've always been doing. It's just that the cost of the testing, the amount of testing is going to increase with those experiments that we're going to be running. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think I misunderstood. I thought you were taking the capability of actually conducting the not so much the sampling, but the actual analytical test.
No, we're not getting in the middle of that.
So I was thinking, actually, I think that might be a good opportunity for the state to run its own tests, but it's a big project to do that. Okay, that's all I had, and I don't see any hands up. So thank you very much,
Sure.
Mr. Venture, for meeting with us. You gave us some really good information. So
Thank you.
And
The one thing I was going to ask Mr. Patali before he left was, I guess, and I wanted to confirm I'm understanding this correctly, and I don't know if you guys are in the same perspective that I have, but it looks like the DES is looking at each individual. Oh, good, you're still on, John. I thought you were off. Glad you're there.
Nope, just jumped off camera.
Oh, good. It sounds like we're still evaluating each individual PFAS compound's toxicity on its own. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that the risk assessments are looking at them cumulatively. So in other words, you're doing a risk assessment for PFOA, PFBA, all the individual compounds, but there's nothing that really adds them together to look at what the health effect, do they complement each other in their effects on the human body? I don't think that that's being, and I don't know that that can be conducted.
So in risk assessment, there are tools that we can use to basically look at multiple risks from different angles, and that depends on how the chemical works and how it causes its effects. So there are tools to do that. The problem is, like the rest of risk assessment and a lot of other processes, it's imperfect. So one of the things we're very reliant on is having data to show how chemicals might interact together. So with PFAS, there have been some studies that show that they sometimes on some health effects may or may not work synergistically. But one of the challenges is that with the human epi studies, those are conflicting, so it's hard to pick which way that they might be working synergistically. But there's also studies that are starting to come out that are showing that some of these may actually be antagonistic to each other. So they're competing for the same sites to have effects, or they're competing for the same spots in the body. So the problem is it's sort of a wash right now, and we're not sure which way is the most accurate way to make those assessments. The other issue too is because of how different some of the PFAS are from each other and some of their health effects and the doses at which they cause effects and the way that they move around and can accumulate in the body, they're almost more comparable to other chemicals. So it would become a situation of how do we assess all of these and relative to arsenic, manganese, disinfection byproducts, several other compounds that may be present. So it creates a lot of uncertainty. And that's one of the things where in several cases, so like with Minnesota, Michigan, New Jersey, several other states, EPA on several compounds, we've done an individual one to address the compounds that we have adequate information for, and we can make confident assessments and decisions about. Some other states have taken the approach of doing grouping, and that comes down to a risk management decision. That's a policy decision. That's something that right now we can't quantitatively or based on evidence support that approach. So it is frustrating. We do realize these occur as mixtures. We're not ignoring that, but it's also the question of what can we take and defensively put forward, acknowledging the whole body of literature. Like our program does not have the convenience of picking and choosing which studies we want to review and ignoring things that disagree with us. Like we have to incorporate the whole body of literature.
Is
So
that
that's
set
the
by
issue.
the rules? Is that limit that is that policy set by the rules that are in place, or is that just an elective policy that's in place?
So that comes in based on information on the chemicals and like risk assessment and recommendations that we can provide around that if we have evidence that they're interactive. But it's also just a level of, for example, with Merrimack, you're discussing if PFBA is going to be an issue and if you're going to act on it. We don't have the data to show that single-digit parts per trillion is an immediate or chronic health risk. We just don't have the data to show that that is able to interact with PFOA or the other compounds in that way. So that's something, if that's a decision on policy level, that's not something that we can actually back with where the science is right now.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, then thank you very much, Dr. Vitale. Thank you, Mr. Preventure. I'd like to move on now to the legislative update.
I'm gonna head out. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks a lot, Don. Representative Mooney, do we have
Thank you
enough?
very much. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. I will keep this very brief as I'm able. We have 3 bills that we are awaiting gubernatorial action on. So those bills are the following: House Bill 1546. That's related to relative to airborne rules relative to airborne PFAS in certain circumstances, sponsored by Representative Boyd. House Bill 1547 related to soil, and also with the amendment from the Senate of the $25 million earmarked for rebates and grants, prime sponsored by myself. And then House Bill 1185, prime sponsored by Representative Rung, and that's related to wastewater. So those three bills, 1546, 1547, and 1185 are currently awaiting a governor's signature. That being said, I just want to point out House Bill 478, which received an interim study recommendation from the Senate after quite a 2-year ride of getting through the House and so forth. Just want to put that on everybody's radar, keep an eye on it. Even though the bill has been given an interim study recommendation, the issue has certainly not gone away. And that's related to operation and maintenance of wells 4 and 5 that Commissioner Preventure referred to in his talk today beyond the year 2025. So hopefully with ongoing conversations with the Attorney General's office and DES, that conversation will remain alive. Next, I want to go through some dates that are very relevant coming up very soon. The filing period on the House side for incumbents for next year is September 6th through the 16th. Then another filing period on the House side for all elected members is November 9 through 22. October 28th is the last day for the House to give final reports on bills they've concluded as interim study. So by October 28th, the House has to either give those bills marked for interim study a recommendation of future legislation or not. Interestingly enough, I had a talk with the Senate Clerk's office this week, and the Senate side, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a senator here, but on the Senate side, there is no such deadline for an interim study bill. So the Senate has a much looser way of managing bills that they have deemed interim study. They have no deadline and no duty to give it a recommendation for future legislation or not. So with that, I'm gonna, like I promised, keep it as brief as I can. I think I hit the main points. I have produced a link to all of the final versions of the bills awaiting the governor's signature in the chart that I still maintain. And I'll conclude it there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Representative Mooney. I also want to bring attention to the commission that on Wednesday, June 22nd, there is a full committee work session of the Resources, Recreation, and Development Committee of the House, where they will be addressing interim study on several PFAS-related bills. There's HB 1440 relating to surface water quality standards, HB 1167 establishing an action containment level for perfluorinated chemicals in surface water. There's another one on drinking water, which is HB 1602, 1618, which is addressing a cumulative total for the maximum contaminant level. So that's sort of regulating them as a class. And yeah, so those are PFAS bills that will be going to that committee. And as Representative Mooney stated, their recommendation of whether those bills should go forward in the next term or not will be important. So I plan to attend that. I can give you an update at our July meeting. Any questions for Representative Mooney? Oh, yes, Ms. Allen.
Just a little bit of a procedural or maybe strategic question, I guess. You said that the Senate doesn't have a deadline, right, for what's been referred for interim study. So HB 478, as we know in the Senate, committee, that was a very frustrating experience, listening to them. And the chair of that committee made a statement like, he didn't even want to hear it. He basically said, he doesn't like this bill. He thinks it doesn't send a good message to businesses that could be coming to New Hampshire. Senator Daniels stood up for the bill, which was great, and basically, spoke well to it. So my question is, given there's election in the fall, if people change, people leave office or voted out or whatever, this lack of deadline for Senate, does it die like in this session, or does it go into if there's any changes in the Senate committee, or do we start all over again? That's my question, because there's extreme resistance from the chair of that committee who just basically doesn't like this from a philosophical reason, which is too bad. He wouldn't listen. So that's my question. What happens without the deadline? I mean, is that endless, or does it end when the session ends?
Well, go ahead.
Thank you.
Representative.
Yeah, thank you for that. Not being a senator, my thought to answer that question is that that bill could very easily go without any further action, period, this session. So that would then result in starting from scratch or, introducing another bill. Certainly that option is available. In fact, the Senate Clerk's office made mention to me that most bills in the Senate that receive an interim study recommendation do not have further action taken on them. So the majority of those interim study bills do not have further action taken. So that could be a good measure as well. On another note, the chair of that committee, it was interesting, the discussions that happened in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. My take from the chair of the committee and the vice chair, who I spoke with at length afterward, was not so much they are disinterested. They were very sympathetic, but again, trying to overcome that hurdle that they're not interfering with contractual relations and court isn't the way to go was the big hurdle once again in the Senate. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, I concur with Representative Mooney. I mean, essentially, after the election, there's a clean slate. Any bills can come forward. They're not beholden to any action of a previous, general court members. Okay, I'm going to move along then. I had asked, Ms. Mesmer had submitted some questions offline of the last commission meeting to Ms. Beam from the Air Resources at NHDS, and I felt that her response would be of interest to all commission members. So I asked Ms. Mesmer if she could give a summary of that interchange, just to educate us all on what's going on from an Air Resources perspective. Ms. Mesmer?
Sure. Yes, thanks. Yes, so we had I had a bunch of questions after our last meeting for Ms. Beam. She very nicely responded in detail a couple of days ago. So I haven't had a full chance to really digest all of the responses in full, but the questions I had centered around the fact that stack testing is conducted once a year. The company knows when DES is coming. DES conducted a post-stack testing inspection in January, according to Ms. Beam. But I'm concerned about the fact that, it happens once a year, they know we're coming, and what happens the rest of the year. So some of my questions were around that, especially given the fact that the current permit only addresses 2 regulated compounds, and Mr. Wimsatt told us that we think that will be addressed in the following permit after the temporary permit expires, so that's good. But as Lorene said earlier, the stack testing results tell us that it isn't completely destroying all the PFAS like the community and the commission was told. And not to say that there's something a bad reflection on DES, but it is a reflection on the fact that the technology is not completely destroying the compound. So there are still at least 19 PFAS chemicals coming out of the stack based on that one-time sample event. There is a concern about that because we know, as we had said earlier, that EPA had found 190 PFAS chemicals coming out of those stacks. then you look at the rainwater samples, and the rainwater samples are only being analyzed for 24 PFAS compounds. The stack emissions are only being analyzed for 49 PFAS chemicals. So there's a big set of PFAS chemicals coming out of the stacks. There's a smaller set that we're analyzing for in the stack emissions, and an even smaller set in the rainwater samples. And then when you look at things like, there was a question about formulation samples and the PFPRA that was detected, and that isn't being analyzed in the formulation either. So it's possible that there's a lot of other stuff. The formulation samples, I should say, are the ones that were collected in the dip pan. So it's supposed to be most representative of the raw materials that were going into the stack testing inlet. So, and those, that again is a smaller set of analytes. So, and then we look at only regulating 2 of the 4 that are supposed to be regulated. So we're really like, this is really ratcheting down the list of what the potential could be in the future of exposure. So that's a lot of where my comments and questions were centered. I think the rainwater samples should be expanded, the list, to include, as close as we can get to 190 compounds, as well as the SAC testing. Other concerns I had were that not all the production lines were being funneled into the RTO. The comment was that from Ms. Beam was that they're not known to have PFAS, but based on the fact that we don't have a lot of trust in our community or our state with what has been told to us, I was a little disturbed about the fact that, they didn't think that the bypass should require reporting. And that is an issue that we have been concerned about here in the commission, is the use of that bypass, which has been used for 45 hours since the system was started up. And the feeling that they don't feel that that needs to be regulated doesn't make me feel really like I can trust them. So a lot of these questions are kind of getting at, yes, there's a lot of processes in place and DES is following that, what they have to follow, but is that enough for us? And that's where I have some concerns. I'm trying to see if there's another couple. I think that's basically what I have, but looking at what's happening in terms of what's showing up as breakthrough in the system and what's we know showed up in that 80 compound list, it makes me think that there really needs to be some additional attention on the raw material use. And I'd like to know if the state is really getting a comprehensive list of what raw materials are being used throughout the year to ensure that that system is really being tested for the stuff going in to the system. So that's kind of a nutshell of my assessment of that so far.
Okay, are there any questions? If there, it may be worthwhile to have Ms. Beam come back to address the commission on some of these particulars, particularly as we are approaching a legislative calendar where we can take action as legislators to submit bills. So that will be a focus, as I've mentioned before, in the next couple months. We'll get into that calendar later, but I want to be very well prepared in September that the legislative members on this commission will be positioned to submit LSRs if based on the work we've done. I don't want it to be a last thing. Yes.
I have one additional comment I forgot to add. So one of my concerns is that there should be an external data validator involved, because currently all the information that we get is from a consultant that was hired by Saint-Gobain. And I don't know if most of the commission members are aware, but there has been some whistleblowers, attorneys that work for Saint-Gobain that have lawsuits ongoing right now where they're been retaliated against for talking about things like this. And so I think, us being aware of those comments that are being made and the lawsuits that are in progress, having external independent validation of what's happening, because it has such a huge effect on the communities around that plant that, that's something that we might want to really look at in the fall.
Good point. Ms. Costello?
Yeah, and Mindy, is it possible for you to get permission from Catherine Beam to share that exchange that you had? It sounds very comprehensive. and I'm very visual. I'm wondering if that's something that you could share with this commission.
I'll get her approval, but I think just by nature of the fact that it's a communication, it's public. So I can definitely share it with the commission.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Dr. Bush. I know this meeting's going on kind of long, but do you have an update from DHS?
I'll be brief. I wasn't sure there was going to be room today, so it's good to be here. I had missed last
always
meeting, so good to reconnect with everyone. You know, I don't have any major updates. I did want to let folks know that DHHS continues to convene our cancer concern review team. And I believe the group is meeting Monday, in fact, to review a draft report that we expect to make available, publicly available this summer, that will summarize the department's data analysis and recommendations for next steps regarding the ongoing cancer investigation in Merrimack. And related to that, just like at EPA, there's been a lot of work going on federally at CDC and ATSDR, and wanted to let everyone know that there are some current draft guidelines for examining unusual patterns of cancer and environmental concerns that were recently released by CDC and ATSDR, and they are open for public comment. So I'll include this in my notes, as well as the link to where this new draft guidelines can be found. This is after probably a year or so of a process to talk with subject matter experts as well as affected community members. I think some folks here on this call have been a part of focus groups and conversations to inform these new draft guidelines. So those are now available, and the comment period is open through the end of July, or July 25th specifically. The agency will be reviewing these and plan to provide feedback to CDC and ATSDR in this time period. I wanted to just highlight, the feedback gathered through this process that is really reflected in these new draft guidelines, focus on placing a greater emphasis on engaging with communities and community members, as well as recommending that health departments consider proactive evaluation of cancer data routinely as part of the ongoing surveillance, and specifying steps in the cancer investigation process to address environmental concerns more broadly, perhaps de-emphasize the role of statistical significance as the single criteria for moving on with an investigation, and for utilizing and developing tools and templates to support the work really at a national level, so response to these concerns are more standardized. So as I mentioned, we will plan to review and contribute feedback during this public comment period, and invite you and other partners to do the same. And so I think many of the commission members will be happy to see some of the expansion of recognition of the role of affected communities, as well as the consideration of environmental factors when moving forward or moving through these investigations. So those are out and open, and I'll be sure to include those details in my notes. And I know that last time there were updates shared about our new DHHS website, so I encourage people to go and continue to explore and the content on those web pages. And if you have questions, happy to direct you to the right places. And I believe also an update was shared on our Choose Safe Places program that falls under the broad interagency apple tree program. And just as a very short update on that project, in case there were questions last time, the Choose Safe Places program for early care and education program is really focused on reducing exposures to contaminants from water, air, and soil in the childcare setting. And we just recently launched in May what we're calling a well water sampling project to provide free water quality testing and treatment funding opportunities to childcare providers across the state that are served by a private well. And so they have now been invited to participate. I think about 20 facilities have registered to participate so far, and we'll be working with DES to then coordinate those samples, thus the actual sampling, to make it as convenient as possible. And for the interest of this commission, the panel will include a full set of PFAS, as well as sort of the standard contaminants plus radon and VOCs. So it'll be a quite comprehensive data summary around well water quality of childcare facilities. So that will be ongoing through the summer. And we hope to really be able to recruit, have a high return rate or a high participation rate of these childcare facilities. There's approximately 75 facilities we estimate to be served by a small private well that does not qualify as a public water system. in the state. And so those are really our target for this project. Those are all my updates, and so I'm happy to take any questions or.
Dr. Bush, I have a question. Those childcare facilities, can those include in-home facilities, like an in-home childcare provider who's been, who's licensed with the state?
Yep, so our focus is the universe of all licensed childcare facilities, and then those that are serving 25 or fewer served by a private well because they do not qualify as a public water system.
Do you have any communication on that I can share with my community? I suspect there has been a jump in those in-home childcare providers post-COVID or even during COVID. It would be great if there was a graphic or something announcing that testing opportunity that I can share. If you have one, if not, I can just take what a text from your comments.
No, I can share our invitation letter, and we also developed, I think, a 2 or 3 page FAQ to try to really.
That would be great. That would be great.
Encourage this, and just keeping in mind the eligibility criteria that it is for those smaller facilities that serve fewer than 25 people.
Okay.
And so, but yeah, I'm happy to include the example invitation letter in our FAQs.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mesmer?
Yeah, thanks for that update, Katie. So on behalf of people that have been asking questions about this, I really like what I hear about not only including non-significant cancers, but also some of the other things you mentioned. And some of that is the basis for the questions that I get from people is why, because I live in Bedford, it doesn't seem I'm getting the attention in this, the kidney cancer results that came out. People are asking, they're not getting follow-up calls. They're wondering why they're not being included. And what's the status of making sure that we capture all of the people that live in, they say that, some of the areas are even more exposed than some of the areas in Merrimack. So within the consent decree area. So I'm just wondering how DHHS is going to follow through with those individuals.
Yeah, I think that as the CCRT, the Cancer Concern Review Team, finalizes this report and it moves through the approval process, I expect that this will document an explicit case definition to include the geographic area, the time period, and the outcomes of interest that will become the case definition for further follow-up. And so that's where we would then determine which geographic areas would be part of further investigation. So I expect that to be called out in this report. And I encourage you to submit comment that support those details in the new investigation protocol. I forget exactly, there's a line in there, that says upon review, the geographic area may be expanded in line with, known environmental exposures. And so consistent with your feedback. So that would be the line to perhaps support and show support for. But I know that the ongoing investigation in Merrimack, sort of the concrete definition of that case definition is something that is being discussed and will be clear in the final report, or this interim report, I should say.
So a follow-up then. So the state is looking at other communities around there in terms of the exposure or the rate of cancers, and then not just the kidney cancer, but focusing on more than the ones that may reach almost near statistical significance?
No, I don't think I can answer that right now, Mindy. So I don't have the answer to that question, but I expect that that will be clarified in the report when it's available.
Thank you.
Dr. Bush, I have one follow-up question that just kind of came to mind. As far as the child care facility testing, that those that are on private wells, will the test be done on water at the well or as it comes out of the tap?
Now, when it comes out of the tap, because that's our primary point of interest, what the water, the water being consumed.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because I know in Merrimack we've had some issues with like lead may be very low going from the well, but it's picking up lead in the plumbing. And so it's good to know that it's going to be at the tap.
Yeah, and our tests will be conducted on the primary faucet used in a childcare, but we are coordinating with the program responsible for sampling for stagnant lead in all taps. And so those samples will also be collected from all taps within a facility. And that's a coordinated effort across the agencies.
All right,
We
thank you.
just, as a funny aside, we did talk about, just the logistics sometimes of getting to those samples. And also if there's a treatment system in place, it will also be post-treatment system. It's really, the goal is to get at what people are drinking.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Bush? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to subcommittee reports. Are there any subcommittee reports?
No.
No? Okay, we'll move on to, we have some really good news. I mean, I think you guys have known what a struggle it's been to get documents on our website. It's essentially been stagnant for over since COVID. Staffing issues at house support services. I'm now told I have to go directly to IT, but I had some really great news from Amy Russo, who is our host for these meetings. She's with DES, and I've asked her to give us an update on some exciting stuff they're doing there as far as communication. So Amy, if you could update the commission on the work you're doing, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. So I know some of you are aware, we are currently in the process of updating our website. So that would be the New Hampshire PFAS investigation website. So the original, which is the current website, was designed in 2016, was put up really to serve more as like a blog and to give updates on the investigations at TCI and St. Gobain, and a repository of information for the public. But since then, so much more work has been going on at the DES, and it goes far beyond what is currently on that website. So we are redesigning it. I want to point out it is going to be a separate website from the DES website. So it will look similar because we're using the same state template and format, but it is going to be its own standalone website. So we're pretty excited about it because we're going to bring in what all the different bureaus and programs within the DES are working on as far as PFAS is concerned, so it's going to be a lot more comprehensive information as to what we are working on here at the DES. As Representative Rung mentioned, one of my goals too is to make this a place where the public can come and find the majority of the information they need on PFAS. So I am going to have a page for the commission. We're going to post all of these meetings on our calendar. And then as part of that, we're going to post the videos and the meeting minutes and any presentations that come out of these meetings so that the public has a place to go to find all of that after the meetings are done. And then another thing that I have discussed with some of the communication subcommittee members is also posting the separate town websites on this webpage as well, so that it's in one place for people to go to and they don't have to struggle to find information. So that is what we are working on right now. We are starting to finalize some of the pages. We're hoping to go live by the end of the summer. So that's where we're at with that. So I don't know if anyone has any questions.
I'm so excited about that, Amy. It's even better than using the House Commission sites, because people will have access to so much more PFAS information than comes from this commission. So I can't thank you enough. We got to get together. I owe you a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or something for this work. You've done phenomenal work. Thank you. Ms. Murphy, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's actually not a question, it's a comment. I just wanted to say how grateful I am personally to Amy, and the town of Merrimack is to Amy, because she is 1000% always accessible, always the first one to give us a heads up about a grant opportunity, a communication tool. I mean, I don't, and I say all the time, I don't know what we would do without Amy. So one of those people that people, residents don't see, and represents DES so well. And I am so thankful, and thank you, Amy, for this. One more thing on her plate, and I don't know how many. I still think she's twins, and she's just not telling us because there's way too much work for one person to do. And I just want you to know how much I personally appreciate it, and how much we talk about you in Merrimack and say what an asset to DES, and how we can't imagine how we would do what we do without you. So thank you so much.
Yes,
Well,
thank you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I am here for all the other towns as well. So feel free to reach out as a resource. That is my role, and I'm here for you. And Nancy, I am a Gemini, but I do not have a twin.
Okay. I know we're approaching 2 hours. Gosh, thanks for your patience, everybody. Is there anything anyone wants to bring forward from the commission before we accept a motion to adjourn? Yes, Ms. Allen?
Just very briefly, this subcommittee on communication was talking about the lack of representation for a citizen representative from Litchfield. And we really feel strongly that we want to ask the committee to look at members of the commission who have been inactive via email correspondence or meeting attendance or everything. We have someone in the works who's going to be the citizen representative for Bedford. And that's fabulous. And we seem to feel like we can access and find a Litchfield resident who will be engaged. And I don't know if the rules of order say that the commission can make some sort of motion at some point, or I have no idea the procedure, to kind of say, what's the policy, if someone hasn't been active, because Litchfield is absolutely not represented in any of our work. And, it's a little town, but we know those private wells are heavily impacted. And we feel as a subcommittee, the phrase that came up in our last meeting it was a very powerful one. And we feel that we have an ethical obligation, as does the state, to really, really reach out and communicate and involve, engage everyone who's impacted, regardless if they're inside the inner boundary, outer boundary. It's the whole extent. We're all impacted by this. So that question I would just put before you, what to do about this lack of engagement, with the whole community.
Yeah, thank you for that. I did follow up with Londonderry with the rep, and there was supposed to be some conversation at one of their town council meetings about getting representation, active representation, and I'll follow up with them. And then Litchfield, yeah, obviously, I'll take that on myself, Maureen, and report back at our next meeting. Speaking of which would be, if we look at the second Tuesday of July, that's July 8th. So we'll meet at 10 o'clock. Am I getting, Lorraine, you're looking a little confused. Am I not looking at the right calendar? We meet on the second Friday of the month at 10.
You said Tuesday. That's sorry. I heard you say Tuesday, but the date is the Friday.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. Maybe I did. Friday, July 8th. And at 10 o'clock will be our next meeting. All right, great. And with that, Ms. Murphy, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to regarding this, the communication subcommittee. I know that Michael Strand, the citizen representative from Bedford, is actually on the call. I think he's just on the phone. We're not seeing him, but,
yeah,
he's
I
here.
have been inviting him the last couple meetings. I just didn't know who was on the phone.
He's here. Yep.
Okay, great. All right, then. It's 11 o'clock. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Okay, made by Mr. Dunn. Thank you. Seconded by Ms. Murphy. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Great. We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye.